Good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Selden. I'm the president of the Montessori Foundation, and this is Independent School Leadership Forum. I'm here with my dear friend Clint Lausch from Ames, which is a school marketing agency and one I highly recommend. Um, every week, Clint and I try to bring you either ourselves or with guests a topic that we think might interest you as Montessori or independent school leaders. Not that those two are necessarily different. Um, at the Montessori Foundation, we are school consultants. We're nonprofit. We're more affordable. We speak Montessori. We also speak independent school, private school, parochial school, whatever kind of school, public school, charter school. And today we are talking about why your school should move to mastery and progress report-based learning. Before I get started, Clint, any housekeeping?
Yeah, as always, you'll get the recording. There's the post-webinar survey. Let us know what you like, what you want to learn more about. If you need any assistance from Tim and the Montessori Foundation when it comes to consulting, professional development work, or if you're looking for all-in-one software, marketing, admissions, tuition, classroom management. We have the Montessori Growth Suite and the Growth Suite for non-Montessori schools as well. That's really an all-in-one platform to help prevent you from duct taping solutions together, and you finally have an all-in-one spot to do those things that every school needs to do, from marketing and social media and advertising to your admissions process and classroom management. So if you're interested in that, there's a box saying, hey, I'd like information on the demo, and you can check the box. We'll have slides and handouts that will come out with the recording. And if you ever want to go back and check any recordings, or maybe you don't see the email that comes out, usually it comes out 24 hours after, you can go to Montessori Foundation YouTube page. They're going to be posted there. And certainly use the Q&A feature. If you have questions for today, use the Q&A box, and we will get to that either during the session or towards the end. But yeah, I'll be here. I'll be behind the scenes. Tim, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll just monitor the chat and the Q&A.
That's great. And please feel free to jump in. And for any of you who have thoughts about this, we're happy to hear from you either by the chat, or if you raise your hand, we'll unmute you and we're happy to have you talk to us. I should mention we also do a webinar every Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. That one is specifically about admissions and marketing, recruitment, building community, reducing attrition, all those good things. So we know that this topic is something that interests some of you, is old hat to others. We notice that the enrollment this week is lower than typically. We usually have a couple hundred people attending, and I think this week is considerably lower. However, the topic is worth doing. If you're a Montessori school, this is probably going to sound silly because we don't believe in letter grades. We already do mastery-based learning, although we may not think of it that way. That is what we typically do. But I think that this is increasingly worth considering. And I will give a plug for my friends at the Mastery Learning Consortium. They are working with private and public schools at the high school level to encourage them and facilitate their use of non-letter grade based reporting schemes. And if there's interest, I'll be happy to invite the people from Mastery of Learning to come and join us for a future webinar. Today is not specifically about them. It's just sort of the basic principles of why we can do better than the typical letter grade or the numerical grade. So traditional grading systems are usually either the parochial or some independent school, how many points out of 100, and it's reported that way, or they use a letter grade. I'm not quite sure where letter grades came into the scheme of things. I haven't checked the history of education to see who invented that silly thing. I can tell you a lot of what we in North America take for granted about education actually comes from Germany in the 1800s, when the city of Heidelberg, as I recall, it might have been Hamburg, one of the big cities, paid industrial expert to design their public school system. And the whole thing was based on the idea of efficiency and standardization and, you know, grading, what height was the blinds in the classroom and were you on the right lesson for the right day, what we now call pacing guides. And this concept is lovely, except in the real world, as we know, real children don't really master material at the same pace. I mean, you can teach a lesson to a group, and some kids will actually understand it and remember it, and other kids will, you know, they'll forget it as soon as the test is over, or they never get it in the first place. So we believe strongly that traditional grading systems tend to be limiting. They often fail to reflect true student learning. Mastery and progress-based learning are more complete, more personalized, and we believe tend to give teachers and parents and students a more practical result. However, I want to acknowledge we are deeply ensconced in the traditional scheme of grade-based reporting. It's really hard to get parents and students to accept anything other than that. And so I just want to acknowledge that if you feel you cannot do it because your parents or your students won't accept it, I understand. So we ask the question of what is mastery learning? The first thing is students advance through learning objectives upon their demonstrated mastery, not the time since I gave the lesson. So again, the train moves on in traditional education. I gave the lesson on Monday, I gave the quiz on Wednesday or on Friday or the following Monday. It is your problem to learn the material. And if you don't learn it, I give you a grade that reflects my belief about how well you met my objective. What we're trying to do in mastery-based learning is take responsibility to, to say, we want you to learn it. We know we can't make you learn it, but our job is to try to help you to find a way through whatever obstacles stand in your way. We want you to succeed. And so as we move kids along, we're individualizing the instruction so that students move from lesson to lesson and objective to objective based on the evidence that this student actually has mastered the skill or the knowledge or the understanding that I had in mind. Now, I do want to point out there's student-centered learning, which is where kids are not only being looked at individually, they're also given a vote or choice in what do they want to learn. This is not based on that assumption. This is based on the idea that whether the student's learning it or whether we're assigning it, we're trying to not move on until we believe the student really has met the objective. Second is we focus on essential skills and competencies. The reason I say that is a lot of instructors get a kick, whether they're aware of it or not, on throwing in curveballs. You may recall as a student asking the teacher or someone else in the class asking a teacher, is this going to be on the final exam? There are many, many teachers who love to throw obscure things that either they never talked about in class or they mentioned it, but they didn't give you any indication this was going to be a major focus of the exam. So we try to focus on what is really important in the lesson, because the truth is not everything is equally important. So we really try to focus on what are the essential skills. In addition to that, anything else you learn is gravy. The third is we really want to make sure the student knows what you have in mind. The learning goals are very clear. They know exactly what you're looking for. They know how they would prove that they have met the standard, and we can measure it. It's not just my arbitrary decision of, Clint, I think you deserve an A plus. It is not about how much you participated in class. It's do you understand what we were trying to teach you to do? And then finally, In mastery-based learning, we are providing an individual pacing for each student. Now, that's really hard. I remember in the early 60s, before I went back and became an adult Montessori educator, trying to figure out as a high school history teacher, how could you individualize learning? Because kids learn in different ways, they learn at different paces, they have different interests. And if your real goal is to facilitate learning, not simply to give a lecture, you've got to figure out, how do I meet each student where they're at? Mastery-based learning attempts to solve that problem. I will make a plug for Montessori. I don't think it's the only method in the world. I'd be silly if I thought that. I can tell you that it is much easier in a Montessori context to individualize instruction than anything I've ever seen before, in part because in the graduate level teacher training, you're not only given a curriculum that's individualized, you're given a methodology for structuring the learning experience, the day, the year. The whole program has been pre-designed to make it possible to treat students as individuals. So I'm a great fan, to say the least, of the Montessori method. The benefits of mastery-based learning include that it encourages deeper understanding of concepts, in part because, one, it's rewarded, as opposed to if you were in India or if you were in China, for example, or in Russia, normally only things that they know are going to be on the test are given any serious attention because they're under way too much stress. In a mastery-based learning approach, the student knows what they're absolutely going to be held accountable for, but they also know that they're being encouraged to learn more than that. And it encourages kids trying to understand how it all fits together. What is it? How is it really used in the real world? Second is it creates a culture of ownership. Generally speaking, kids in this kind of school, whether it's Montessori or otherwise, usually feel like the school is not a high stress experience. It's like it's their life. They own it. And that is incredibly important. Now, having grown up in that kind of school, I can tell you it was wonderful as a student. Having gone from that kind of school to Georgetown University in 1963, which was not mastery-based learning, it was definitely grading on a curve. It was a very different experience and much less satisfying, much more stressful. Next, it tends to reduce learning gaps and it tends to increase equity because you're getting closer to every student learning at least up to a core threshold. I mean, we're not teaching to the lowest common denominator. We also know you're going to get a difference among students. Some kids are going to learn at a much deeper level. They're going to learn much more quickly. They're going to remember stuff. I mean, those of you who have photographic memories know what I'm talking about. There's some people who can tell you chapter and verse where they heard this from and what the source is. Not everyone's like that. What we want to do is recognize the difference among children, whether they're preschool or high school or university. And we want to focus on how do we help them become the best that they can become. Finally, mastery-based learning promotes growth as a mindset and it tends to encourage resilience. So these are just some of the core reasons why people choose mastery-based learning. Now, by the way, the reason why people stick to the traditional is, one, you don't get fired because you did traditional. In other words, traditional is what people expect. If you do something different, parents can think you're not a rigorous school and they really want a rigorous school. They may have hated rigorous schooling when they were little, but now that they're parents, they want their kid to have the most rigorous, challenging, demanding, competitive education they can get. And their theory is that's what it takes to succeed in the world. I would suggest that what it really takes to succeed in most professions is tenacity, self-confidence, self-regulation, a sense of gratitude, a sense of that this is not a burden I'm carrying, but an interesting experience that I'm having every day, every week, every month of my life. Ideally, we want kids to be happy. And, happiness is not just because they got a 4.0 average or better. It's, the fact that they're doing things they find interesting with people they enjoy working with, and they're creating, they're doing new things that give them a sense of satisfaction. Now, progress reports. Progress reports are very different from a traditional report card. A traditional report card says the name of your school, it says the student's name, it has their grade, it has the date of the report or the quarter, the semester. And then it proceeds to say for each subject, what's your letter grade or what's your numerical grade. So in a progress report, the way it's organized is after you have the name and the period of time and the name of the school, you tend to give the student detailed feedbacks on what they're learning, how they really are doing, what do you believe is true, and what is that belief based on. Next, it shows the mastery levels for every area of the curriculum or every skill in some cases. More typically, it's going to be math, and it'll have a detailed report of what's going on for you in math. The next is it tends to offer a more holistic view than what you typically get in letter grades. Now, again, parents really like letter grades. I mean, if it says my kid got an A+ in science, in their minds, they just got a lot of information. If you were a teacher, knowing that a kid got an A in science doesn't necessarily tell you much about the kid as a human being. So what we're trying to do is give a more detailed picture than what they're normally going to get. And then finally, ideally in progress reports, we can actually give parents information that they can understand, and we can hopefully get them in some way engaged in the learning process. Now, in this kind of approach, there usually is, instead of a letter grade, there's some kind of scale. For example, in a 4-point scale, it might be the kid is at a beginning stage. I gave him the lesson. He really can't do it on his own. He needs a lot of guidance. Understanding is not real deep, but he's beginning. The next one is typically something like developing or approaching mastery, which is showing growing competence. But again, the performance is inconsistent and it needs refinement. The next one is what some people would call mastered, which is he's proficient or he meets a standard. And for a lot of kids, that may be as far as they go. But this is the skill is demonstrated. It's demonstrated without us hand holding them or basically giving them coaching, help, to guide them into giving the right answer or doing it correctly. However, they really don't have it to a point where they could actually teach someone else what's going on. And then finally, if you say that they have truly mastered it, or they exceed the expectations, or they have advanced mastery skills, we would say the student really understands this. He can teach it to someone else. He can use it creatively in all kinds of situations. This is a skill that he's really got down cold. So the benefits of progress reports include the idea of a continuous feedback loop that improve learning outcomes, that they are easier to track student growth because we're not taking a course like Biology 1 and simply say, your daughter's getting a B. Okay, and what is that? What is she learning? What do you mean she's got a B? What's really going on? And the point is these letter grades don't really give much information to the next school. They don't give much information to the student, to the parent, to anybody. And so what we're trying to do is find a way to give a more nuanced and comprehensive view of what's really going on in the process of learning. The next is in progress reporting, as opposed to letter grades or numerical grades, it's easier to track individual student growth. Hopefully it helps with the communication between school and home in terms of how's your kid doing. And hopefully we hope it will support data-driven instructional decisions. Now, not every school really does much with data. We would argue that data is much more reliable than sort of a gut instinct of how well the student is paying attention in class and how well they're doing. A lot of teachers really don't know that much about what's going on, and they just rely either on a standardized test that the kid took on paper and pencil or on a computerized device. But they don't really know that much about the student as an individual human being. We're trying to go a little deeper. Now, there are some implementation steps that most people would argue. If you want to try to move in this direction of mastery learning, the first thing you got to do with each of your courses or each area of your curriculum is establish clear learning standards and competencies. And this probably already exists. I mean, most curriculums have this available. They just call them learning objectives. It's just we tend to focus on a syllabus of topics to cover instead of skills to see if they really understand it or can use it. The next is we want to train the staff on the mastery approach, and we want to teach them how would you prepare some kind of report that's based on mastery learning as opposed to the standard letter grade. The next thing is we want to develop or we want to adopt tools that allow us to track mastery learning. And that's a whole thing in itself. But knowing how one would figure out how well a student learns something is something that it's important to learn how to do. The next is we want to communicate the changes that we're making in our learning program to the parents and the students. And then finally, we want to try it out on a pilot scale. We want to review and we want to see what's going on and just gradually scale it up until our whole school is used to this approach. Now, there are some challenges and solutions. One of them is students and parents are often resistant to change. And ideally, especially with teachers who may not understand it at all, you need to give them lots of training in how to do this practically, because it may not be something they're comfortable with or familiar with. Same thing with students, same thing with parents. You want to help them understand what are you doing and why are you doing it. The second thing is we want to think about aligning our standards and our assessments. And the reason for that is quite often what we're teaching and what is going to be actually tested and then reported as a result of a test are not very connected. So we want to think about what are we trying to accomplish and how are we going to evaluate what's actually happened. The third thing is we want to challenge technology. The challenge is technology integration. And the bottom line is for a lot of this, you don't want to use paper and pencil. You want to use some kind of a software solution. There are really good tools out there. There are other tools that leave you kind of wandering in the wilderness. So you want to plan very, very carefully. So an example of what this can look like, there was a K to 8th grade Montessori school. They were giving letter grades. They wanted to go to mastery-based learning, which is traditional in Montessori, but not all Montessori schools follow it. They did do it. So again, it's mastery-based reporting. The report card to the parents went from a letter grade, like a traditional public school report card, to a Montessori approach. So the first thing that happened was within 1 year, the teacher and parent conferences became more productive. The students participating in those conferences began to take more leadership in talking about what they had done in the last term. Their engagement in class rose. Teachers could target interventions more effectively because they knew where the students were having difficulty. So again, here are approaches to think about levels of mastery. Mastery can be seen as a continuum, not a binary he has or has not mastered the skill. The second is the International Baccalaureate is one group that tends to have levels of achievement that you may find useful. They're pretty good at thinking about how students demonstrate understanding and mastery of their skills. You can align mastery levels with Bloom's taxonomy, if you're familiar with that, from the idea of remembering things all the way up to the ability to apply skills and knowledge in creative new situations. And the mastery learning approach tends to highlight student growth and highlight their depth of understanding over time. So one of my favorite approaches to reporting progress is the portfolio strategy. And I think part of the knowledge, the information on the slide has gone up and off the screen. But the bottom line is that the idea of the portfolio is you're creating a collection of student work. It could be photographs, it could be videos, it could be samples of student work. Ideally, it's not just a shoebox filled with stuff randomly. Ideally, it's organized like a timeline or a photo album. It could be subdivided into different areas of learning like math, engineering, whatever. But we try to have artifacts that provide evidence of what the student is really doing, how well they understand things. And some of the things that are on this page are worth noting. You could have samples of art, samples of their math work, their handwriting, their reading. You can have photographs, you can have videos, you can have examples of projects they did, practical life activities, all these different things. Lots and lots of teacher notes of what you observe the child doing. When they get older, you may want to be putting in multi-step projects that are the actual write-ups of the project. You might have write-ups of their science experiments. You might have essays and novels. You might have self-reflection and goal-setting sheets of different sorts. You might have peer feedback and collaborative work samples. And at secondary level, you would have typically research papers and captions and, capstone projects and presentations and all kinds of creative work. Lots of evidence of leadership and community service and extracurricular activities. So again, in narrative reports, what you're typically doing is you're combining a portfolio with a summary document that's essentially an essay. And the essay may be organized to talk about different areas of reporting, like mathematics and geometry and biology and so forth. You could also talk, of course, about their social, emotional learning and so forth. So the idea of the narrative is it should read like a really good report of what went on this last term. How did the student grow? What did the student do? It should offer the family and the student rich, personalized feedback, much, much richer than the typical letter grade. Teachers can structure narratives around key areas such as academic progress, areas of curriculum, work habits, social emotional growth, moral development, all kinds of things. You can use a consistent template to help teachers remember how to build their narratives. This really helps. With an intro paragraph, areas of strength, areas where the student needs to put in more time and work, what's coming next, things like that. The next is you can incorporate student self-reflections in addition to the basic report of what they were working on and what they seem to have learned. And finally, you can focus, if you want, on clear evidence-based statements rather than lengthy prose to make narratives manageable. And those narratives don't need to feel like you're writing a novel. So we would recommend that if you really decide you want to do this, if you're not already, The first, you sit down and you have a conversation with your school leadership team. Second thing that we would recommend is you explore the tools and resources that you have available to you that help support mastery learning and progress reporting. Next, you organize a pilot because you're not going to necessarily do this with the whole school. You could do it with one part of the school and try it out. And then finally, you need to commit to some kind of plan, a timeline of how you're going to put this into practice. So that's the end of my presentation. Let me see if I can get you folks to ask any questions or unmute yourselves and comment.
Yeah, I didn't see any come in right now, but certainly Q&A feature there if you have questions. And again, in the post-webinar survey, continue to let us know kind of what you want to hear more about, whether it's on this topic or any other topic. And we will certainly deliver to you as we're doing these, every single week. So we appreciate a lot of you being on here with us every week.
If any of you are running a Montessori school, and I see that Soraya has raised her hand, I'll get right to you, Soraya. If any of you are at a Montessori school, let me offer you this thought. We have a planned sequence of lessons. And while it's not exact, I mean, there's multiple pathways you could follow. There is a sequence, there is a logic to it. There can also be other things that the student is interested in that you didn't plan, like they want to learn about bunny rabbits or breeds of dogs. The bottom line is often when our teachers plan a lesson or report that a lesson was given, that's where it stops. And just because you gave a lesson doesn't mean a student actually understands it. And just because they can move pieces of wood and metal and plastic around on a table, on a tray, or on a rug doesn't mean they actually understand what they're doing. So what you're trying to do is really think in terms of levels of mastery, and you don't simply present once and think that that's all you have to do. You come back until you find evidence that the student actually understands what we had in mind. Soraya, I see you've raised your hand, my friend. Want to unmute? Soraya?
And Tim, while Soraya maybe jumps on while we wait on Soraya here. Oh, here we go. There is a question in the Q&A, whether you want to answer that now or after, which is we're developing a new system for this over the past couple of years, proficiency scales, mastery, etc. We're stuck on the progress report. Do you have example template that you could share for progress reports?
Sure. Soraya,
Yes.
hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Oh, great, great. I didn't know how to unmute. I couldn't see anything here. Good to see you. Great topics. I have a question. There was a year that parents decided to pull their children out in the second year from elementary and fourth year from elementary and take them to the private schools or even public schools. So as they were taking them for shadow day or for them to be to see how much they know, so they had to go through tests, and these children have never had any tests before. They didn't know what to do, so they keep saying that what are the teachers doing and they don't know anything, so they had to start from the low go back. If they were in going to third grade level, they're going to repeat the second year again. So parents were furious and they were losing their hope and faith in Montessori. So I would like you to give some tips about that. How do we convince? Because Montessori is not the competitive method of learning. It is individual and with every child's pace, but we know out there everything is competition. So how can we convince the parents in that way?
Well, Soraya, first off, the ability to take a test is a practical life skill. Teaching them, this is how you may be asked to demonstrate your understanding, and this is what it looks like to do it on a computer or on a traditional paper and pencil test. To me, teaching them that skill is just common sense. In fact, I would teach them how to design and write their own tests. I also would emphasize that just because it's a practical life skill doesn't mean you need to fall into that trap and start basing your education on that. So teaching them the idea of a time test, the idea that you can't cheat, you can't ask your buddy. In other words, they need to know how the game is played. We also need to understand that there's lots of ways to do what I would call formative assessment, which is deep evaluation of does a child know something or not. And it is absolutely true that in a traditional school, kids are taught to do things like add any two numbers in a certain way. For example, in one school, when you're a little kid at first or second grade, you might see the addends on a horizontal line like an equation, 23 plus 42 are, or you might see them stacked over each other, each of the addends. And something as simple as that. If a child has not been taught that these are two different ways to think of the same thing, they may have trouble. The other thing is many of us don't teach skills in Montessori at the correct age. And as a result, they may end up in first or second grade, and they're still doing things that we ideally would have been teaching them when they were 4. And that can be a problem because kids need to be at a level of abstraction to be able to do a lot of these things that they're going to be tested on. At the very least, they need to know how would a child in a traditional school solve this problem, or did they memorize it? I think those are two things. So what you're trying to do is, you're not only trying to do pure Montessori, if that's what you're doing, and make sure you understand and your teachers understand what the best practice in Montessori looks like and come as close to that as you can so your kids aren't actually behind, and understand the difference between highly competitive and holding kids to reasonable expectations. For example, if your school doesn't have a formal curriculum scope and sequence, as opposed to our curriculum is our teachers' Montessori albums, those are not curriculum guides. Those are albums that help teachers to think about how do I give a lesson as opposed to how do I track student progress. So you have to have a way of training teachers to think about what do kids normally need to know? When do they need to know it? How would I know that they know it? And how do I measure it? As opposed to thinking, if I don't have textbooks, I don't have workbooks, I don't use standardized tests, I can't do it. So I think part of this is serious training of teachers in how one manages the curriculum. The late Dr. Michael Dorr had a great course, which we still teach by Dr. Robin Howe at the Montessori Foundation, called You Can Teach It All, How to Manage the Elementary Montessori Curriculum. And certainly I would recommend that if your curriculum director has never taken that course, you may want to call up the foundation and see when they're going to offer it next, because it's a really good one. And there aren't a lot of people other than public Montessori schools, which obviously have to learn to do this. But a lot of us, the majority of Montessori schools are private, and many of us kind of have, in my opinion, a confused understanding of the difference between competitive teaching or evaluation as opposed to having standards that are reasonable but are not based on the idea that education is a race. And that we could have a whole conversation on this because we are talking about continuous progress learning, but it's not whatever you'd like to learn whenever you'd like to learn it. There is a standard of when we expect a kid to begin to normally know certain skills, and your teachers need to know that really well.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The parents want in a very fast pace. The children should know, and they are comparing them with the children in the public schools. And I agree with you that they most probably they memorize it without understanding. And no matter how much I emphasize on, we care about the process, not the result. The process of understanding is important, more important than how did the child got to this result, is more important than just know, write a few numbers as a result in a math problem. But anyway, thank you so much. If you could please tell me about that course that you said that the public Montessori teachers are taking about curriculum. Could you repeat that, please?
Great. It's called You Can Teach It All. It was originally developed and taught by Dr. Michael Dorr, who passed away last year. His apprentice, Dr. Robin Howe, teaches it now, and he does it periodically over the course of the year to groups of students. It is excellent. I highly recommend it. And if you write to info@montessori.org, they can let you know what the plan is as to when it's going to be offered next.
Thank you so much.
Welcome, Soraya. And again, when you do the survey at the end, if there's a topic that I've triggered today that you would like us to look at in more depth, we can, first off, I can address it, and I can also bring colleagues in from around the Montessori world to talk in greater depth about anything you're interested in. Now, I saw that something came in, Clint, in the chat or the Q&A. What was that?
Yeah, so there was the Q&A that said we were developing a new system for this over the past couple of years, proficiency scales, mastery, etc. We're stuck on the progress reports. Do you have an example or template that you could share potentially when it comes to progress reports?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think what we would call a progress report, typically a narrative report. Now, keep in mind, narratives can be different in some schools' mindsets. So some people have essentially a list of learning objectives the students worked on in the last year, and that's very granular and I think very appropriate. However, the average parent doesn't know what to do with it when they get it. So if you use a Montessori record keeping software or something equivalent outside of Montessori, where you get a list of learning objectives or Montessori lessons, like can add any 4-digit addends together, dynamically with, caring for it or borrowing or whatever. Those are very specific objectives, and a parent doesn't necessarily know what you're talking about. So a narrative report is typically layered onto a more detailed report. And some schools actually share the detailed report, and others make it available if the parent wants it, but they don't shove it in their faces because they know that the parent's not going to know what to do with it. So a narrative is typically an essay that simply says, in mathematics, in math in the last term, we covered the following things. And this is how little Mark, did. This is where he was strong. This is where he struggled. He still doesn't seem to understand fractions. We're working on that. He really enjoyed this. Here are examples. Or in the portfolio, you'll find examples of the math problems he's working on, things like that. Should you ever wish, we can do a much more granular workshop for teachers on how to write narrative reports and how you really do this at the teacher level. I hope that helps. Please jump back in, either unmute yourself or put something else in the chat if I really didn't answer your question.
Perfect. Thanks, Tim. And there was a comment in the chat about, that it's a vital point to distinguish between lessons given and students' actual mastery.
Yeah. Well, again, at least in Montessori, we often think if we've given the lesson that we've done our job. And I'm sorry, I can't tell you how many kids I have known, having grown up as one of these kids, who fool around with the materials on the shelf, I mean, on a rug, and we look really busy, but we're really hanging out with our buddies and we're talking about stuff, and we don't really understand what we're doing. So again, what we're looking for, and what Montessori meant by the word observation, is the ability to dig in deep and try to understand, what does the student really know how to do? What do they understand? Can they teach you how to do this if you act dumb? Um, so we're looking for deep learning. And of course, we can't do that on every single learning objective. There are thousands of learning objectives, but we certainly can train teachers to go pretty deeply. And that's our goal, is to really know our students as individuals and as human beings. Anyone else? Anyone want to raise their hand and unmute? We'd love to hear from you. I see my friend Margaret is here. Dr. Pollock's here. Lindsay, I would love to hear from you on this topic. You were a public school principal for decades. This is your stuff. If you're here, unmute. Let's talk.
Here you go, Tim. There was a follow-up message here in regards to the question about progress reports. We have quote unquote critical concepts in each subject area: math, language arts, cosmic studies, practical life, etc., for each grade level, and a 4-level proficiency scale. I agree that the parents can get overwhelmed with looking through these. I think the narrative makes so much sense. I think a training for teachers on how to write would be very helpful. I think we as admin worry about adding more work to their plates and that they'll feel overwhelmed since it's new. In the past, it was just lists of lessons completed, which really did help parents, or which really didn't help parents. So thank you for your help. But yeah, there's a follow-up comment to that.
Great. Lindsay, you should be able to unmute now, my friend.
Hi, Tim. Thank you so much. Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I think this is, it is a conundrum. As a public Montessorian, we used to say we are Montessori on, on steroids, the good steroids, because we have an opportunity to implement and, run a Montessori program with fidelity, and to have the additional standards and expectations of progress. Now, that said, we had children who progressed at different stages, as we all do, everyone here. So we have students served in special education who moved faster in one area and perhaps slower in another area. We had gifted and talented children, and we had typical children who, their progress was varied. And all of that to say that we wanted to maximize the individual capabilities of every child. So that meant for us having adult systems of record keeping to see how kids were progressing throughout the day and throughout each grading period, so that we could communicate with parents in a public setting, and to bear in mind also that I was a private school principal for many years before I went to the public sector. We used things like the Iowa Test of Basic Skills or the Stanford to help kids with those practical life skills of test taking, and to help parents understand where their child was compared to, right? Children the same age in other parts of the country. So a norm reference test would be looking at where children are, comparable children of that same age in a like setting. So we thought it was important, even in a private school, to be able to say to a parent, here's your progress, and here it is in a way that might be more quantifiable than a portfolio or a body of work. But we used both. So we had both the adult record keeping, the anecdotal, the running records, the student work, And then we also use some sort of standardized test because, we believe that while the heart measure is very important, our feelings and perceptions around where a child might be is strengthened by using a more formal tool. And again, this gets to measuring progress in both qualitative and quantitative ways. That it's not just one day and one test, but that we're helping communicate to parents where their child is. And as kids get older, they can participate in that process by setting personal goals, by becoming more involved in developing their own learning plans and setting goals for themselves about where they want to be and what they want to study and the projects that they develop. So I agree, Tim. I could talk about this all day long, and it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Not because I was, a public school principal and had that standard that I needed to meet, but also because I believe it's good for our children. That we want to make sure that children are progressing, and like you identified, whether it's in a Montessori classroom or an IB classroom or any other setting where kids have freedom of movement, sometimes even adults we can get a little off track and not stick to the goal and the focus where we're supposed to be. So having those measures are really guardrails to help us um, make that progress, to maximize the individual potential.
Well, Lindsay, that's great. I really, really, Lindsay, they want your email.
I'm happy to share.
Absolutely.
I'll type it in the chat.
We should mention that Dr. Pollock is the Dean of Studies at Sarasota University, or is
Yes,
it
that is correct.
So Sarasota University is the world's, as far as I know, the world's first recognized Montessori university, fully accredited, all online, offers bachelor's completions, master's degrees, and a new doctorate that's starting off.
Yay!
Montessori education.
That's right. We are the first and only MACD accredited university at this time.
Yep. And Lindsay, I would love to have you come back and present with me. I think that would be wonderful.
Oh, I would be honored, Tim.
So in closing, let me just say this. Whether you're a Montessori school or not, there's a lot to learn from Montessori. Montessori, in one way of thinking of it, says, look, you have to teach a curriculum. There's no question. You're being paid to help children learn some knowledge and skill. On the other hand, our goal is to work with the current of human nature instead of trying to swim upstream against the current and being exhausted, or asking questions that are stupid, like, kids, why can't you learn this at the schedule that I wish you would learn it? What we're trying to do is focus on what's really happening. The child is put in the center instead of us as the educator and our lesson. And while we have to teach, and while we're gonna do what we can to guide the student to learn, to present the lesson, to make it accessible to the child, but our focus is equally on, is it working? Does the child really know what we're talking about? And so that concept of paying attention to what's really occurring, how does the child understand this, is very close, for those of you that are into Piaget and Vygotsky and constructivist thinking. That's what Montessori observation is looking like an anthropologist at a child and asking, what do we really know for sure about not only what does this child know, but how do we know that the child knows it or can do it? What is our evidence? What's the data behind this? There's lots of ways to gather it, lots of tools we can use, including video and portfolios and other learning artifacts and oral exams and project-based learning, all kinds of things. The bottom line is what we're trying to do is to look deeply and say, have we actually accomplished our goal as learners to facilitate the learning of the students in our care? And whether they're adult learners or we little children, we're still trying to help them master skills and grow. I hope this was useful. Would love to hear from you before you sign off. Certainly want to remind you that when you do sign off, you're going to see a survey. It is really, really valuable to the Montessori Foundation if you take a moment to answer the questions with some integrity, especially things like, was this useful? Was it boring? Are there other topics you want us to cover? Are there people you wish we would invite on? Because we're just getting started with this particular series. And we're just beginning to arrange for other people other than Clint and myself to be with you to make this a really interesting and dynamic service to our community. So before I sign off for the day, any last words in the chat or anyone want to unmute? Because we're happy to hear from you.
I think let's do the promises. It looks like it's like a piping, but I wonder whose piping is it? Is it ours or is it?
All right.
All right, I see what Bethany has written, and I really appreciate you, Bethany. It's great stuff. And I appreciate that you've got someone who's working with the Public Montessori in Action team. They're great. I see that Rachel has said how to bring faculty together on stages of mastery. Okay. You'd like to know more about, basically what you're talking about is how do you write curriculum scope and sequences? Because that's what you're talking about there, the stages of mastery, how they define using evidence. So the first step is, what are you going to teach, and what do you what would be the evidence, and then how do you evaluate stages of learning is what you're talking about, Rachel. What you may want to do is consider, if this is something really useful at your school, you might want to arrange for a customized professional development session for your faculty on one of your PD days. But we'll take this into account and we'll look at organizing something on this. Lindsay, have you seen what Rachel wrote?
Let's see. Would love to have more about how to bring faculty together. Yes, I see that.
Yeah, it might be a great topic for us to look
Yes,
at.
I think that's a great idea.
We could maybe gather some people, from Sarasota University and do a real in-depth here.
Yes, I think that's a great idea.
So Lindsay, let's you and I talk.
Okay, perfect.
We'll preserve what Bethany, you've been writing some really good stuff, and I appreciate this. And please feel free to reach out to me. You've got Lindsay's email. I think you know mine because you get a lot of email from me, but it's timselden@montessori.org. And I would be happy to correspond with you and hear about that. Soraya is asking, could we have a sample of successful curriculum stages for the primary and elementary, please? Curriculum stages, I think you mean a scope and sequence. And if you Google the word Montessori curriculum scope and sequence, you can find the Montessori Foundation's scope and sequence available online. It's also embedded inside of Montessori Compass 2.0. And there are lots of different iterations developed by other people as well. I like ours because we took 6 human years to really do rigorous crosswalking between the public Montessori standards and so forth, and what Montessori teacher training centers do. So I'm quite confident that ours is rigorous. I'm sure there's other people who have equally rigorous stuff. This is great stuff. I see Bethany again is, she's talking about the Public Montessori in Action. They're a great group and they've got great resources too. So again, you're not limited. There's lots of people out there who want to help. You don't have to feel that you're betraying your integrity if you begin to use data and you begin to actually have some kind of planned curriculum. Let me close with one thought. One of my heroes in education was Professor John Dewey. His progressive education movement of the early 1900s was brilliant. very compatible with Montessori in many ways, but Montessori survived and progressive education is almost dead. One of the reasons why it died, in my humble opinion, is that he did not develop a coherent system for helping teachers to enter the profession with a pre-written plan. They basically had to develop their curriculum and their program by emergent curriculum strategies, and that's exhausting for most people. While there are teachers who can do it brilliantly, most teachers can't even begin to muddle through that. So what we really encourage people to do is stand on the shoulders of giants. Don't think you got to develop it from scratch. I think that's it for this week. We're a little bit over time. We're so glad you joined us. Lindsay, I will give you a call and we'll
That sounds great. I look forward to that.
and Soraya, feel free to reach out to me. Hopefully you know my number. If not, just call the Montessori Foundation, and if I'm not there, they will forward your email to me. But again, contact me at timselden@montessori.org. I can say that without getting into trouble on YouTube, but I can't give you my phone number without apparently getting into trouble. So I will see you all next week. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Take care,
Thank
guys.
you.
Again, Lindsay,
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Great.
Surya.
Thank you.